0. Good evening, colleagues. My name is Professor Gisela van Rensburg, and I will be presenting tonight. We also met last night, so I think most of you have joined the session last night. And this evening's session is on how to prepare your your thesis for examination and how to respond to the examiner's comments and feedback. I will share my screen. Right, so what we are going to discuss tonight is some of the policies and procedures. We also spoke about them last night when we spoke about the oral examination, but I will take you through some of the policies and procedures related to the M&D matters. And then we will talk about how to prepare your work for examination and how to respond to examiner's feedback. And then we will have a question and discussion session. Now, in terms of the assessment of dissertations and theses, students should feel safe when it comes to the assessment. The policy really looks after students. So the policy says that assessment of master's and doctoral students will be rigorous, fair and consistent, and will include reports from 2 examiners for a master's degree, of which at least 1 is external to UNISA, and at least 3 examiners for doctoral degrees, of which at least 2 must be external and 1 an international examiner from another country. Then it's also important that as students you know that on successful completion of the dissertation or the thesis, your thesis will be archived in the UNISA institutional repository in accordance with the policy and cognizant of the restrictions related to intellectual property, patents, grants, and prospective institutional agreements. So I just wanted to highlight these aspects from the policy so that you know that the assessment process is done in accordance with policy and that your thesis will also then appear on an institutional repository. Right, and then just as a reminder, we spoke about that last night as well, but as a reminder, students who started or were admitted in 2022 and are completing no earlier than 2024 will deliver an oral defense, an oral examination, or a viva voce, or a viva. You will hear the different terminologies. And this will be compulsory for those students who at registration were informed that they will have to do an oral examination. In exceptional circumstances, there might be a face-to-face oral examination, but that will be arranged with you beforehand. Then also in terms of master's candidates or students, this may only take place in exceptional circumstances. They might call a master's student to do an oral examination, and this could be if there is some doubt that the student maybe is not indeed the person who did the research, or if they need clarity on certain aspects, but this is not the rule, it's in exceptional cases. So in the cases where students must do oral examinations, the certification of the degree will only be after the oral examination and the results, the second round of results have been finalized. Then in terms of publishing articles or writing manuscripts, again from 2022 onwards, first-time doctoral candidates are required to submit 2 manuscripts for publication to a peer-reviewed accredited journal as part of the thesis phase. You will communicate with your supervisor in terms of these manuscripts, which journals you have to prepare them for, and which journals are indeed accredited journals. There is a list that the Department of Higher Education and Training has compiled of all the accredited journals, and you will be informed of which of these the journals that are in your field or in your line of research is indeed accredited. Then the students will also be informed at registration whether they are required to complete these manuscripts. It is not required of master students to write a manuscript, but it's highly recommended that you do communicate your research through manuscripts, and this you will do in collaboration with your supervisor. And again, very important, if you fall in this category, your results will not be released until the proof of the acknowledgement of the journal editor or the institution is submitted by the supervisor. The supervisor completes a form, it is the V35 form, when the student is ready to submit, where the supervisor then declares that the student has indeed submitted the manuscripts on the prescribed or as prescribed in the policy. Right, so if you are a doctoral candidate who does not have to do the oral examination, there is one round of examination. So these will be students who have registered prior to 2022 and whose registration information did not include the oral examination. So your process will then be the thesis that is submitted for examination or dissertation, depending on whether it's a master's or a PhD. The thesis goes through the examination process. The examination reports are received. You make corrections to the satisfaction of the supervisor and according to the examination reports, and then the supervisor writes the final report and writes a report on the corrections that were made, which goes to the non-examining chairperson, who then submits the exam results to the college, and then it is processed from the college to the College of Graduate Studies and the examination department for release of results. Now you will hear that it is quite a process. It is not just a matter of the student making corrections and completing the revised thesis. There are also administrative processes that are involved. So take that into consideration when you are waiting for your exam results, when you are getting anxious about the results not being released. Just take into consideration there are administrative processes that also have to take place. Then students who have to do a viva voce or oral examination, there will be 2 rounds of examination. The first round will be like in the previous slide. The thesis will be examined, the provisional reports will be submitted and will be provided to the supervisor, and the supervisor will discuss that with the student. The student will make corrections, and the supervisor will check these corrections, write a report on the corrections, and submit that to the non-examining chairperson. Then the second round will take place, and that will be the oral examination. The non-examining chairperson will then communicate with the supervisor and the student, and they will determine or will be given a date and a time for the oral examination. The oral examination will take place, and after that, the candidate might have to make more corrections to the thesis, which will then be done under the supervision of the study supervisor. The corrections will be made and submitted, and the 2 manuscripts, the proof that the 2 manuscripts have been submitted will also be submitted, and then the supervisor follows the same procedure in submitting the report to the non-examining chair, who then in turn submits the report to the college, and then from there it goes to College of Graduate Studies. Now, how do we prepare our work for examination? You will note that I've been repeating some of the processes, but it's important that you understand these processes, that you know exactly what is going to happen. If you do not understand the processes, communicate with your supervisor. Your supervisor will assist you in what you should do when you are ready for examination, and we will talk about how you can prepare your work for examination. There are 2 submission dates, and we will talk about these dates a bit later, that these dates are well, we'll discuss them in the next slide, but students have to adhere to these dates because they can affect the registration of the next year, or needing to register for the next year. It's important that you meet all the requirements in terms of what must be submitted. So we will go through a list. What do you have to do? What has to be part of your thesis when you submit for examination? The title is very important. You have registered with a certain title, but that title is not necessarily the final title. It might be a working title. So we will discuss the importance of the correct title when you submit the thesis. We will also discuss the layout of the dissertation or thesis. You had a session or sessions where they discussed the chapters, the different chapters of a thesis. We will just talk about some of the issues that you have to look at when you look at the layout of the dissertation and the content of your thesis. We'll also need to remember that the requirements for the manuscript submission is very important if you fall into that category of students who have registered in 2022. And then, of course, the oral examination, if that is applicable. When a supervisor gives you permission that you may submit, please remember that that does not mean that the supervisor implies that you will pass the study. The supervisor merely says that you have done the research and he or she agrees that the thesis or the dissertation can now be examined by external examiners. But it is not a guarantee that you will have a successful result. In the end, the results will be based on what the examiners say. Right, so when you are ready to submit and you've discussed this with your supervisor now, and your supervisor will tell you, yes, you may submit the intention to submit. Now, the intention to submit is a document. It's called the CGS 20. You will find that on the website. And that document is completed at least 2 months before the submission date. So if your submission date is going to be June, then you will submit your intention to submit by April. If you submit by 15 June, you may qualify for the spring graduation, but that is not entirely a guarantee because it also depends on the examination outcome and the extent of the corrections that you have to make. So that is the first submission date in the middle of the year. Then 15 November is the second submission date, or the final or the end of the year submission date. And that qualifies you for the autumn graduation in April of the next year. Again, your intention to submit should be at least 2 months prior to this date, so that will be around 15 September. But keep in mind, you submit the intention to submit on consultation with your supervisor. When your supervisor says yes, he or she agrees that you may submit the intention to submit, you will complete that form, and there is an email address where you have to email the document to. It must also be signed by the supervisor. So if you submit after 15 November, but before the end of February, remember now we are treading on thin ice, but it might happen that you only submit in January or February. You need not re-register, but you will most probably only graduate during the spring graduation, because if you submit in February, for example, the processes of the examination takes some time, and you will most probably only graduate in the spring graduation, which is around September, October. But then there are some unusual circumstances which we hope do not happen, but there are unusual circumstances. And I'm going to read you these two excerpts from the policy. The first one says, if the candidate does not submit the dissertation or thesis within 3 months after having given notice of the intention to submit, the College of Graduate Studies informs the executive dean accordingly. If the candidate submits the dissertation or thesis more than 3 months after the notice of intention to submit, they will request confirmation from the academic department whether the examiners are still available to examine this thesis or dissertation. Now, once you've completed the intention to submit, the academic department receives the V35, the form that I've just mentioned in one of the previous slides, that the supervisor has to sign and say that, yes, the student is ready to submit, and yes, this is the title with which the student will submit. There is a valid ethics clearance certificate, and the candidate has adhered to the requirements of the 2 manuscripts, if that is applicable to the student. Then, once the supervisor has signed that form, the academic department appoints a panel of examiners. These examiners are contacted and asked whether they are available to examine this thesis during this period. And once they are appointed, they expect to receive the thesis to be examined. So if it takes more than 3 months, they might not be available anymore. They might either have retired or moved on or be engaged in other activities, so they might not be available. So if it so happens that you do not submit within a certain period of time, then it is important that the academic department is also aware of that. The student receives a link. Once the academic department has appointed the examiners and it's gone through the processes of approval through the college and back to College of Graduate Studies, the student receives a link and uses that link to submit the thesis for examination. So that link might not be active anymore after 3 months. Sometimes it is still active, but it is still important that we make sure that the panel of examiners are available. Then the second point I would like to raise, which is also an unusual circumstance, and we always hope that it does not happen. But if a candidate wishes to submit his or her dissertation or thesis without the supervisor's permission, the student must have consent of Senate to do so. This permission is requested by submitting a fully motivated application to the Executive Dean, who refers it to the Inter-College Postgraduate Studies Committee with his or her recommendation. The committee considers the application and makes a recommendation to the Vice Principal Research, Postgraduate Studies, Innovation and Commercialization. The final outcome is conveyed to the College of Graduate Studies, and that will then also be communicated with the candidate through the academic dean, the executive dean and the academic department. Now, this is really an unfortunate and unusual circumstance, and one always hopes that this does not happen and that it's not necessary. But it could happen, and therefore it's important that you understand what the processes are. So these are the requirements that higher education, the qualifications framework of higher education gives us in terms of what the requirements are for a master's dissertation or a doctoral thesis. We spoke a lot about the unique contribution that the doctoral study must make last night. So the difference between the 2 degrees, a master's dissertation should demonstrate the candidate's ability to work independently and to reflect critically on theory and its application. The dissertation must demonstrate the candidate's ability to deal with complex issues both systematically and creatively, to design and critically appraise research, make sound judgments, and communicate their conclusions clearly. So in a master's study, we want to see that a student can do research independently, that the student can follow all the steps in the research process, that the student can apply the research processes and the methods, and that the student understands the context, the field of research, and also makes sound recommendations and draw sound conclusions from the data that was gathered in the study. In the case of a doctoral thesis, the thesis must demonstrate high-level research capabilities and make a significant and original academic contribution at the frontiers of a discipline or field. The work must be of a quality to satisfy peer review and merit publication. So in the examination report of a doctoral thesis, the examiner will also typically indicate and must typically indicate whether this study is publishable or not. So it is important that the student is able to publish from this study, that the study warrants publication in scientific journals. The important point in a doctoral thesis is the unique contribution that the study must make to the body of knowledge. Then in terms of language, we all know that we are a multilingual group. We have students from all over the world, but even only across South Africa, we are all from different language groups. And so there is also due regard for multilingualism and linguistic and contextual diversity, specifically when they do the oral examination, and with specific reference to your graduate attributes and whether you are able to communicate in the language that the oral examination will be conducted, which will be English. I'm back at this picture, and when we look at this picture, always remember that even though you are satisfied with your thesis, even though you and your supervisor are both satisfied with the thesis or the dissertation, remember that there is still an examiner on the other side, and make sure that when you submit your thesis for examination, that the other side, like this note at the bottom says, that the other side will also see the quality and see the value of the study. Then I mentioned about the thesis, the title of the thesis. When you register with the working title. But as the study evolves, as you develop your research proposal, as you finalize the focus of the study, the title might change slightly. So this title that you've registered with will remain the working title on the student system, and while you are writing working on the research and writing up your study. And it will remain as such until the time that you submit for examination. Now, when you near the completion of the dissertation, the supervisor will then sit with you and you will discuss the title, the working title, and decide whether this title is still focused and relevant and suitable for the study, and whether it still applies to what you have done in this research. If the title changes slightly, and by slightly I mean it might change with one word or two words, then there must be a change of title. And this change of title will be submitted on a V4 form, which will be the responsibility of the supervisor. The supervisor will indicate what the working title is, and then also the new and final title. Of importance is that one must be careful in terms of spelling, and one typical mistake that we often see is the spelling of KwaZulu-Natal. And it's interesting to see how many people do not write KwaZulu-Natal correctly. So make sure that even if it's a hyphened word, make sure that you write the word correctly, because that editorial error will be picked up and it will be referred back to the supervisor and the student before the results will be finalized if there is a mistake. So make sure that all the words, the spelling, the editorial construction of the title is correct before it is finalized. The quality of the titles are also addressed. It must be approved. It goes through a process through College Board or the College Executive Committee for recommendation to the Inter-College Postgraduate Studies Committee for approval. So the title, you will see, if you look at the processes, it is very important that the wording of the title is absolutely correct before the study is finalized and before the degree certificate can be issued. It does happen that students submit with incorrect titles, but that will be picked up when the student submits the thesis onto the system. And in such a case, the College of Graduate Studies will return or will put the process on hold and ask the supervisor to indicate which of the two titles are correct, the title that is on the system or the title that is on the thesis that the student has submitted. And this is done on a form, which is the V20 form, which will be then completed by the supervisor in order to finalize the title. Then when we get to the layout of the dissertation or the thesis, and this, the layout is more or less a standard layout. There can be minor differences in different colleges, in different disciplines, but there is more or less a standard layout of a thesis. That will obviously start with a title page, which is a prescribed format, and I will show you an example of that a bit later. Then you have to make a declaration that this is your own work, that it has gone through a similarity program to detect any similarities or plagiarism or any problems with the thesis, with the content of the thesis. Then, if you wish so, you can make a dedication, indicate that either before or after the declaration. That is not that important. You will, if you wish so, you will make acknowledgements, give due acknowledgement to people who were part of your study or who meant something to you. This is also a very personalized section. It is what you prefer to do and to say there who you prefer to include in the acknowledgements. You can do that as you wish. Then each thesis and dissertation must have a prescribed format of the abstract. For a master's study, it is 150 words. You will typically also have the title, you will have your information, you will have key terms, which are also required by the university. And then for doctoral studies, the abstract will be a maximum of 350 words. After the abstract, you will have your table of contents, and I think most of you will agree that we all generate our table of contents automatically. The software programs allow us to do that. That will help us have a correct and accurate table of contents, because it generates it from the headings that are in your body of your report. You will also have a list of tables and a list of figures with the correct number and name of the table and then the page where it appears. A list of abbreviations and acronyms, and then, of course, your list of annexures or appendices. That will also be a part of your front pages. This is just an example of a title page. You will receive, when you submit your intention to submit, you will receive documentation from College of Graduate Studies, from the examination department, and they will send you an example of what the title page should look like. Now you can see here that typically it is the title and your student name, your own full names. Then it's also important to have the correct degree name. If you are in a discipline where it is a degree with a specific specialization, make sure that you have the full name of the degree, but that will also be part of your documentation, and you will see what the exact name of your degree is. Then the supervisor's name, and if there's a co-supervisor, their name will also appear, and then the date of submission. So the submission will either be November or June, or if it so happens that you submit in January or February, it will be indicated as such. This is an example of a declaration. You will also receive an example from Graduate Studies with all the documentation. And it just indicates here that I proclaim that this thesis is my own work and that all the sources used or cited have been recognized and acknowledged using comprehensive list of references. This is part of the scientific integrity, having referred to sources used. It further states that the thesis has also been subjected to reliable software testing to check its originality. And I further confirm that this thesis has never been submitted at any institution of higher learning elsewhere before, including submission to UNISA for any degree or any other degree purposes. You sign and you give your date, give the date. It's important that you sign. Sometimes students tend to forget to sign the declaration, but please remember to sign your declaration. Here is an example of an abstract. This is a master's study abstract. So you will give the title of the study, your student number, your name, the degree, again, the full degree, and the department where the degree is housed, the supervisor and the co-supervisor. And then it's the abstract and the key concepts, which are in or should be in alphabetical order. And I think I pick up some mistakes that it's not in exactly alphabetical order, but have that in alphabetical order with the first word with caps and the rest lowercase. When you prepare your abstract, remember that this is the window to your research. This abstract will forever appear on the internet, on the websites. This is what people will read. This is the window, as I said. So make sure that you give special attention to how you word your abstract, and how complete the abstract is. When one reads the abstract, make sure that the reader will understand what was the purpose of this study. Why should I indeed read this study? What methods were used? What are the main findings or conclusions, or something that will lead the reader to go and read either the full thesis or the article, if it's an article. But an abstract is always important, because that will always be available to anybody who goes onto the website and searches the specific topic, or puts in key terms. This abstract might come up. Then in terms of page numbering, you will again receive guidelines how to number the pages. Your title page will not have a number. The declaration and the dedication will also not have a number. And so with the acknowledgements, the page will not be numbered, and the abstract will also not have a page number. Then you start with your table of contents with a Roman 1, and you will start numbering the pages from there. Your list of tables, it depends on whether you have your list of tables or list of figures first. But if your list of tables comes first, it will also be Roman numbers, and that will depend on the length of the table of contents. Same with the list of figures. It will depend on the length of the table of contents and the list of tables. Then you will have your abbreviations. That page will also be numbered with Roman numbers, and it will depend on the length of the previous sections that were numbered. When you come to the text, you use the Arabic numbering 1, 2, 3 at the bottom center of the page. Make sure you start with page 1 and number the pages throughout the thesis. When it comes to the appendices or the annexures, your appendices and annexures will have page numbers. For example, your data collection instrument, your questionnaire, will have page numbers 1 to 10 or 1 to 15. You do not change those numbers. You keep those numbers as they are. So what you do to make sense and to have them in a logical order, you can number the appendices as Appendix A or 1, Appendix 2, and you number them in a logical order. Then the layout of the dissertation or the thesis will then obviously have your chapters, and the number of chapters will depend on whether it's a master's or a doctoral study. It will depend on which discipline you are from. It will depend on the extent of the study. So there is no hard and fast rule that it must be 4 or 5 chapters for a master's and 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 or what for a thesis. It will absolutely depend on your study and the layout of your study. And we will talk about the chapters and how you work through the chapters before you submit for examination a bit later. In terms of your annexures, when we talk about logical order, you have to think of the processes that you followed. What followed on what? What came first? So your ethical clearance came first. So your ethics certificate will be, in most cases, will be Annexure 1 or Annexure A. Number them so that it makes sense, because in your text, you will refer to your annexures. So when you talk about your ethics clearance and that you've received the clearance and you've included that when you asked permission to access the research setting, then you refer to Annexure A, and the examiner or the reader can go to Annexure A, look at the ethical clearance certificate, and make sure that it is correct and that it was valid and that it is included in the thesis. We spoke about the page numbers of the annexures. What is also important is that, and that is a requirement of the university, that you include an editor's certificate, a language editor's certificate as part of your annexures, and also you turn it in receipt and report. You can't submit the full Turnitin report because it is very extensive, and you won't include all the pages of the Turnitin report, but you will typically include the first page. I've got examples here. Here you can see this is the digital receipt for the Turnitin report. And then this is the first page of the similarity report, and you add that. It could be a screenshot or whatever way you want to do that. Right, then let's talk about the question, is my work ready for submission? You will discuss this with your supervisor. You will ask your supervisor, Am I ready to submit? Should I work more on certain chapters? But discuss that with your supervisor. And also make sure that you have sufficient time to finalize the thesis. Now, I always say to my students, you need to allow about 3 months to from completion of all the chapters. Say you've written the last chapter. It could take up to 3 months to finalize the thesis, because your supervisor will now read the full thesis or dissertation and give you feedback and ask for corrections. You will make corrections. The supervisor will check these corrections. It has to go to a language editor. It depends on who will edit your thesis, how long it takes, how long you wait for an editor to do the editing. So a tip is that you make sure that you have an editor or have an appointment with an editor to edit your thesis at the time that you are ready. So if you're going to submit in November, make sure that you maybe have an appointment or a date with an editor around September, so that they have sufficient time to do the language editing, so that you have sufficient time to make the corrections, because your final thesis, before you're going to submit your final thesis, your supervisor would want to see your thesis again to make sure that the thesis is ready for submission. So this is really a time that you are going to read, reread, and reread your thesis. And I know at this stage we don't want to read and we don't see mistakes anymore. And it does happen when you work with your thesis and you've been working with it for so many years. You don't see the mistakes anymore. You don't you miss important errors, but it's important that you read critically and that you reread critically. Put it down, put it away for a while, go back to it and read it again. It's also important that you check the formatting. Are the front pages correct? All the page numbering, all the formatting of headings, for example. What are the requirements for headings? Simple things like, is there a heading at the bottom of the page? Because that should not be. Are there empty pages? It might happen that as you move your work or you insert a space or whatever, there might be a blank page in between. So you check for formatting, you page through it carefully. When in the days when we submitted hard copies, it was easy to page for page to see whether there are formatting errors. But online, it's the same. Go through the document carefully and make sure that the formatting is correct. You're going to submit in PDF format. Once you've saved it in the PDF version, go through it again. Make sure that the format has not changed. It's important that you are sure that the pages are still correct, that the table of contents, that something did not move. So check the PDF version very carefully. And you always wait for the final go-ahead from your supervisor, whether you can submit. Right. Now, before you submit your dissertation or upload the dissertation in this electronic format and on that link that was provided to you, when you think of your chapters, and when you read and go through your thesis, it's often a very good exercise to go to the first chapter and the last chapter. And that must be a mirror image. The first chapter will be is the introductory chapter, and that will explain what the study is about, what is going to happen, what the plan was. And your last chapter is the conclusion, and it gives you the highlights of the study. So I always say it must be a mirror image, the first and the last chapter. And you often hear examiners say that they've read the first chapter and then they went to the last chapter. And that already tells you whether there is congruence in the study. And then the chapters in between is the flesh. They are the detail. They give you the depth, the meat around the study. So this is just a tip that you can consider when you read your chapters. Then your next chapters, depending on the design that you use, depending on the discipline in which you do your research, your next chapter might be, the second chapter might be the theoretical background, it might be literature review, in some cases it is the methodology, it depends on what it is. But make sure that your chapter that deals with the literature review indeed is a critical review, a critical debate on the existing literature, that the references that you have used or the sources you have used are recent and relevant, that your reference technique is consistent, and each department will indicate which reference technique they use. Some departments use the revised Harvard, some might use Vancouver or any of the other styles. It depends on what your department uses, and what is important is that you use it consistently. So if you, for example, use the Harvard method or the revised Harvard method, there are minor differences in terms of punctuation. Make sure that you are consistent. Make sure that the reference technique is consistent in terms of spacing, in terms of order when you refer to more than one source in the text at one place. Is it in alphabetical order, or should it be in order of recency, of date? So make sure throughout the study that your reference technique that you've used is consistent. Then also use, I always say, use two screens. Open your list of references or your bibliography on one screen. Go through your text and tick your list of references to make sure that all the sources that you've referred to in the text is indeed in your list. Some people use a bibliography, some people include sources used but not referred to. That again depends on your discipline, it depends on the department's guidelines. So you will know from the guidelines that you've received from your department and your supervisor what style you will be using. Also in terms of headings, and this is not only for the literature review, but is there a logical flow? Is the numbering correct? Are the level headings correct? In other words, first level might be caps and bold, second level might be bold but not caps. So it depends on what the guidelines are, but make sure that there is consistency in terms of the headings. With your methodology chapter, make sure that all the methods that you've used are clear, clearly explained, and that what you have written there is indeed what you have done. In other words, that the methodology is sound and is correct as it was implemented and used throughout your study. When you, for example, have a report on statistics, look at the presentation of your statistics. If you have a p-value, is it written in the correct form? If you have tables and figures, is the table heading at the top? and the figure label at the bottom. Those are some of the basic rules of scientific writing. Has it been presented correctly? Is there consistency in the format of the tables, in the format of the figures? So those are all the finer detail that you have to look at before you finalize the chapter with, for example, the results. Are the results true reflections of what you found? And here your scientific integrity is of utmost importance. Scientific integrity refers to issues such as falsification of data, fabrication of data. Did I refer to sources? Did I give due acknowledgement to other authors when I used literature? Your final chapters or your conclusions, are these conclusions relevant to the findings? Again, think of your scientific integrity in terms of fabrication or falsification. Do these conclusions make sense? Do they emanate from your findings? And are they complete? Are they clear and understandable to the reader? Are they contextualized into the body of knowledge, the existing body of knowledge? Then your final recommendations, have they been written in a logical way? Have they been presented in a logical way? And all the important aspects of your final chapter, has that been done in a logical and a scientific manner? So these are just some aspects that you have to look at when you read through your thesis. Certainly you look at the detailed content. Is it correct? Sorry. Did I refer correctly? Did I give enough detail? Did I give the correct information? Is everything included in the chapters that are required of that specific chapter? So when you are then ready to submit and your supervisor says, yes, they're also happy and you can submit, you have saved it in a PDF format, you will upload an electronic copy of this thesis by means of that link that you've received after you submitted your intention to submit and after the examination panel has been appointed. In this submission, and this is part of your thesis, the ethics certificate should be there, and also the declaration that it is your original work, and the copies of the Turnitin receipt and the first page of the report. You must also, as I mentioned, add the certificate from the professional editor or proofreader, if it's applicable. If there might be circumstances where the department or the supervisor is satisfied that the thesis or the dissertation is not edited by a professional editor, a language editor, or a proofreader, but that is something, again, that you will negotiate with your supervisor and with the department, and make sure that you know what the guidelines and what the requirements of that specific department is. The proof of the valid and correct ethics clearance certificate is very important. Now, it does happen that the title changes sometimes earlier than before the end of the study, but if the title changes significantly, you should have an updated or get an updated ethics clearance certificate. Now, this is an administrative process where the supervisor will typically write a memorandum and explain to the ethics committee that the wording of the title has changed. If there is a focus change, then they might ask for more detail. What were the changes? And then you will receive an updated ethics clearance certificate. The processes before you receive the updated ethics clearance certificate might differ depending on how much it has changed and what is required of that ethics committee. So make sure that this is also done well in advance. Hence my recommendation that you allow at least 2 to 3 months to do all these last corrections and final steps in completing your thesis. The ethics certificate must also show that it was valid at the time of data collection, and that the data was not collected before the ethics clearance was received. I think someone asked last night, once the title is approved, can you continue with data collection? Remember, you never ever start data collection without the ethics clearance certificate. You would need that to get permission to enter the research site and get permission to access the data sources, be it participants or records or whatever you're going to use. So make sure that your ethics certificate is valid or was valid at the time of the data collection, and that it is indeed correct and relevant to your study. Your examiners have 6 weeks to examine, but we've discussed the administrative processes that take place once you have or after you have submitted your intention to submit. So even the process of examination, although it is 6 weeks, there are other administrative processes that take place and that will be added to these 6 weeks. So yes, it is a difficult time, but please be patient. And communicate with your supervisor in terms of the progress. The supervisor should be the best person to give you information on where in the process it is. If you have to prepare manuscripts, and we highly recommend that all students do prepare manuscripts, whether you fall into that category of compulsory manuscripts, the 2 manuscripts, or not, you are always motivated to do or to prepare manuscripts to communicate your research findings and to communicate your study to the broader scientific world. I've mentioned that master's studies are not required, or master's students are not required to publish manuscripts, but it is highly recommended that they also at least publish 1 manuscript with their supervisor. The supervisor has a developmental role in terms of assisting you in how to prepare a manuscript, how to improve your scientific writing, how to write a manuscript from a thesis or a dissertation, which is not always easy because you've got this extensive research report, and now you suddenly have to write a manuscript that is 5,000 words from a 20,000 or 30,000 word document. So it is not an easy task. So communicate with your supervisor, work with your supervisor. Your supervisor becomes your co-author. You will always be the first author because you were the primary researcher in this study. Work with your supervisor and co-publish with your supervisor. This is a part of your development as a scholar, and use that opportunity. As a student, you should play a major role in formulating the ideas and writing the manuscript, or in the cases of the art disciplines, the creative portfolios. It depends on what is required of your discipline. It could be a creative portfolio, but you will play a major role in formulating the ideas, in putting it together, and then co-publishing or co-presenting whatever portfolio you have with your supervisor. I've mentioned the accredited journals. Make sure that you are clear on which journals are accredited and which not. We often receive emails, and sometimes people feel flattered because they receive an email from a journal saying they've read your research and they want to ask you to please submit the manuscript to their journal. Yes, it is a compliment if they write an email like that, but if make sure that that journal is accredited if it is one of the manuscripts that is required of you. There are scholars that publish in non-accredited journals, and it does not mean that if it's a non-accredited journal, it is not a good journal. Not all journals apply for accreditation. Specifically some international journals. So just make sure that it's not a predatory journal, that journal is not just going to ask you high fees to publish your work, and then in the end it's a predatory journal. Your supervisor will be able to give you information on which journals are classified or listed or identified as predatory journals. So the important point is that you do discuss it with your supervisor when you decide on a journal. And then also, of course, be mindful of the publication costs or the page fees. We see journals charging up to 47 or 50,000 Rand to publish an article. So please make sure beforehand what the publication fees are. The university does support supervisors and students in publishing articles in accredited journals, only in accredited journals. So they pay a certain amount of the publication costs, and that changes every year. This year it is 20,000 Rand. And then if the page fees are more than 20,000 Rand, departments may top it up with some of the departmental research funds that they have, if they have funds available. In terms of the examiners, the candidates or the supervisors may never interact or engage with the examiners. The supervisor will also not know who the examiners are. So as student, please do not ask your supervisor who are the examiners or try to figure out who the examiners are. You will never be informed of the name of the approved examiners. So this is a confidential process. The appointment takes place in the department, in the non-examining chair, or in the higher degrees office. The non-examining chair will be the person who communicates with the examiners. The supervisor or the candidate never communicates directly with an examiner. Now, this is just to show you the different categories of decisions or outcomes or results. You will not get the result. They will not tell you whether whether it was a 1.1, a 1.2, or a 1.3, or 1.4, or 1.5. But when the results come, the non-examining chair will receive the form with the results. The examiner will indicate either a 1.2, which says that the thesis be accepted unamended, or the dissertation. So this is a very happy outcome. There are no corrections that are required. They might decide that they only want some minor improvements, which will be a 1.2, and some revisions and editing must be done, and that then must also be done within 2 months. This is also a happy outcome. Because we need to accept that every reader who's going to read, or every examiner, or every scholar who's going to read your work will pick up some issues and might request some changes or some corrections. Then the third option could be a 1.3. That the thesis, the decision is that the thesis be accepted after major revisions, and these revisions or editing must be done within 4 months. So yes, there are major revisions, but it is still not too bad an outcome. Then 1.4 is when the examiner says that the thesis must be referred back to the candidate for revision and for resubmission for examination. That means that there are major revisions and that the student needs to re-register and revise within 1 year and then resubmit for examination. The thesis will only go to the examiners who gave a 1.4, who asked for a resubmission, if the decision is that the student must resubmit. If you submitted during the June submission, it may happen that you can complete the corrections within the next 6 months and that you will not need to re-register the next year. But that will depend on when the results came and how much time there is left to make the corrections. And then the unfortunate decision will be the 1.5 decision that the study is rejected. In this case, there is no revision possible, and the student may not re-register. In this case, a student may reapply after 2 years, but then with a new study and a new title. So it will be a new registration. You will go through a new process of being selected and admitted to the program. But we do not want to dwell on the unfortunate outcome. It does happen in some cases, but we rather focus on the first 3 categories of the outcomes. So how am I going to respond to the examiners? When the reports come, the non-examining chair will submit the reports to your supervisor. These reports will be anonymized, so you will not see who the examiner was. You will receive the reports. Before you start with responding to these reports, making corrections, you're going to communicate with your supervisor. You're going to make sure that you understand all the processes before you start with the corrections. Make sure what is required of you. Make sure what the timelines are, how you have to make your corrections. It's very important that you understand the processes before you start. Sometimes you will also get, apart from the report, you might also get back a copy of your thesis or dissertation with comments from the examiner. These comments are also anonymized so that you do not see the name of the examiner. We've got that pencil again that we spoke about yesterday. Yes, you might be shocked, sometimes one is shocked by a report that is not even a bad report. It is that initial shock of the feedback that you got on your study. So you might be shocked, but make sure that that pencil is sharp and that when you make the corrections, that you do them carefully and correctly. It's also important that you approach your corrections in a logical manner. You've now got 3 reports. You're not going to jump in and start with report 1 and make all the corrections just point for point as they have written the one, and then you go on to the next, and then you start from the beginning again and start on chapter 1 and make corrections that examiner 2 requested, and you do the same for examiner 3. You first read through all 3 the reports. You make sure that you understand all the comments. You make sure that you address, if there's a comment related to the background of the study, make sure that you address all 3 examiners' comments related to the background of the study. Or if it's comments around the methodology, make sure that you look at all 3 the reports and make sure that when you make the correction in a certain section, that you attend to all the reports. And you will discuss these corrections with your supervisor before you jump in and do that. But as you make the corrections, you will indicate in a report, and we normally ask students to compile a table. Some departments may have different ways of doing it. An easy way is to compile the table with 2 columns. On the left column, you have the comments of the examiner, and on the right-hand side, how you've made the corrections. Or you can write a rebuttal or a response. In other words, if it is a correction that was required by an examiner and you did not implement that correction, then there can be a response, and that will, of course, be in collaboration with your supervisor. If the examiner wanted a certain change and the examiner says that that is not a change that will be to the or contribute to the quality of the study, or it might not be entirely correct, there could be a response why the change was not made. Some examiners might require a title change. This is also something that you will carefully consider and discuss with your supervisor, because the title change must not change the focus of the study. So it cannot be changed just because the examiner would have preferred you to have a different title which is not aligned to your problem, your purpose, and your objectives, or aligned to the focus of your study. So the title change is something that is carefully considered by the student and the supervisor, and then the final decision will then be made, and the amended title will then be submitted to the College of Graduate Studies, and before the results are released, the title change will be indicated. If different titles are suggested by examiners, the non-examining chair, in consultation with the supervisor, recommends the amended title. So there must always be clarity and agreement that the new title is indeed a correct title. When you submit the final copy, you will submit it with the amended title. So when you do your corrections, you have your thesis in front of you, and you now start making the corrections. Your supervisor is going to check these corrections. So a good way of doing that is to highlight the corrections so that the supervisor can check, or you put it in a different font color. You will agree with your supervisor how you're going to do that. So the supervisor can then check all the corrections against the reports. As I mentioned before, the comment or the correction should not be seen in isolation or followed blindly. You read the reports carefully, you look at all the corrections, and then you implement the corrections in a logical manner. Sometimes they will make comments in the report, but not all these comments or corrections can be made. So if they ask you to change something in your methods, you cannot change the methods because you have followed certain methods, you have followed certain procedures. You cannot change the sampling technique, for example, because you have used a certain sampling technique. So if there are comments about the sampling technique, maybe your justification for the choice of the sampling technique was not good enough. So go back to how you've explained it, your justification for the specific sampling technique, and explain that then in more detail to address any uncertainties around that specific aspect. When you make a correction to a section in, say, for example, in chapter 1, don't just merely make the correction. After you've made the correction, read that section again. Does it still flow logically? Is it still editorially correct? Does it still say what it is supposed to say? Is there not a repetition now? Or is there not something that I've left out by deleting or removing certain sections on the recommendation of the examiner? So read the sections again. And good practice is to read the full thesis again after the corrections have been made. Also check your page numbers and the table of contents after the corrections. You might have added some information, you might have taken away some of the information, and the page numbers might have changed. So please look at your table of contents and the page numbers again. And then before you submit the full document to the supervisor, check the final document for all the aspects that we've discussed here tonight in terms of formatting, in terms of content, and in terms of logical flow of the content. Now, again, in certain circumstances, you might be unhappy. Again, an unfortunate situation, but there is an opportunity for appeal, and the policy states that all masters and doctoral candidates have the right to appeal against unfair practice in supervision or examination. Appeals are monitored and resolved by the Senate Research, Innovation, Postgraduate Degrees and Commercialization Committee unless they have been satisfactorily concluded at college level. Consider appeals carefully. Do not appeal because you feel that you should have obtained a distinction for the master study and now you've only obtained 65%. There must be a valid reason and a strong reason for appealing. The appeals process can take a lot of time and it might not be successful, but please consider it carefully and really have a valid reason for submitting an appeal. Then the approval and the release of the exam results follows this process. And as I've mentioned, there are administrative processes after the corrections were made, and you need to be patient. It might take some time. You really want those results and you are impatient, but please make sure that you understand the different processes that have to be followed to finalize the results. Communicate with your supervisor, communicate through your supervisor. We see it a lot that students write to all and sundry about their exam results. They are waiting for their results. They haven't received it. Their friends have received their results. Each of these examination processes are unique. Each student's process is different and unique. There are different examiners, different non-examining chairs. The processes might take longer in the one case than in the other. So please work through your supervisor and always keep in touch with them. After the final approval, you will submit your final PDF electronic version before the conferment of your degree, and to refer back to cases where there is a title change, make sure that you have the new title everywhere where it is applicable. Indicate the new title. You cannot change certain documents. You cannot, for example, change the permission letters that you wrote to an institution to access that institution. It will that will remain the same, but the thesis will have a new title, and everywhere where it is applicable, the dedication, the declaration, the abstract, then you correct the title in those instances. Once the results have been released, remember the supervisor also only gets the results at the same time as the student. So the supervisor, it will not help you to try and bribe the supervisor to give you the results beforehand. The supervisor will also get the results the same time as what the student, they get a copy of the same letter that the student receives. Once the results have been released, the supervisor submits a final PDF version onto the institutional repository. You will remember at the beginning I said that is one of the requirements, that the thesis and the dissertation will be uploaded onto the institutional repository, and that will be done by the supervisor. And in the case of the College of Law, a copy will also be uploaded onto the library of the Supreme Court of Appeal. Important to note is that the degree will not be awarded unless the candidate complies with these requirements by a set date as set by the university. Then, just in conclusion, the official results will be released by the exam department, as I've mentioned. It cannot come from the supervisor. It will be an official letter that the supervisor and the student will receive. And that is the end of my discussion, and I would like to open the question and answers. I will go back and I will go to the questions and answers. The first question asks, are there any steps that should be taken in instances where the working title is exactly the same as the final title? If there are no changes, there is nothing that you have to do. There is nothing that the supervisor has to do. When the supervisor signs the V35 form, it will have the one title and the supervisor will just sign and you will submit with that title. How much percent Turnitin results do we tolerate as a PhD thesis? This is a very difficult question because we do not necessarily look at the percentage per se. It depends on the matches, what the percentage is per match, and that again will also depend on what these matches are. So of importance is that the supervisor assesses the entire similarity report and goes through the report. The supervisor also confirms that they have seen the similarity report, that they are satisfied that the similarity index does not exceed the acceptable percentage. You will get institutions that say it may not exceed 15%. Others might say 20%. Others might say 5%. It depends on what the similarity report shows. What are the matches? Sometimes it will pick up matches like headings that you cannot change. You cannot change research design, for example. It might pick that up, but it depends on what the full report shows. And this is something that the supervisor has to go through and discuss with the student and look at possible instances where there is too high similarities or plagiarism of certain parts of the work, or what the case may be. There's another question about the acceptable range. As I said, this is study by study, and it is if there's any doubt in the percentages and whether it is an acceptable percentage, the supervisor can have a discussion with the integrity officers. I had a case where I was not sure about one of my PhD students' similarity index, and I've worked through the whole report with the integrity officer, and we looked at all the similarities that were picked up, and we realized that the percentage was affected by the model that the student used, the theoretical framework or the model that the student used. It picked up the concepts of the model, and that is something that you cannot change because you cannot change that model. She used the model to apply in her study. So that report was discussed with the integrity officer, and the report was accepted. I have recently completed the proposal in the master's level. I changed the first title, but the results came with this old title. So I wish to know, what must I do in order to have my new title? I'm not sure whether it was at proposal level or whether it was at the final level of the study. If it was at proposal level, it can be changed. You will discuss the change with your supervisor. Your supervisor can request a change of title although the policy states that we do not change the working title during the study. There are some instances where the title has changed and might influence the ethical clearance process or might influence the permission process. Then the supervisor may ask for a change of title earlier, but you will discuss that change of title with your supervisor. If your study has been completed with an incorrect title, that would be very unfortunate, because the College of Graduate Studies, the exam department, picks that up. They pick up the differences between the title on the system and the title on the submitted manuscript. So I think in your case, it is the proposal as you've indicated in your question or your comment. Then there's a question, will UNISA ever appoint an ex-supervisor as examiner? If I understand this correctly, you want to know whether they will, for example, appoint your master's degree supervisor as your examiner in the doctoral study? No, that will not be the case. There are criteria that the examiners have to meet in order to be appointed. So that would typically be a conflict of interest, and then that person will not be appointed as an examiner. How does the university deal with supervisors whose students receive decisions 1.4 and 1.5 from the examiners? The 1.4 is where you have to resubmit, make corrections and resubmit. It depends on whether there is one or two supervisors. It depends on the extent of the problems that were identified in the study. But the exam department or the college research or higher degrees committee will recommend that support is given to the supervisor in order to optimally support the student to make the corrections. So it might be necessary that the supervisor also gets a mentor to support them in supporting the student as best as possible. But the supervisor and the support that the supervisor should give the student in the corrections is key. So the communication between the supervisor and the student is key. But there will always be support to the supervisor as well, in order to make sure that the support that the student receives is the best possible support. In terms of the 1.5, which is a fail, that is very unfortunate and a very sad situation. Students might and supervisors might need a lot of support and even counseling in some cases, if there is a case of a 1.4 or a 1.5 rather, which is a very unfortunate outcome. But in terms of the support to students and to supervisors, there is always support from the department side, from a mentor, from an experienced and seasoned supervisor to assist the supervisor in optimally supporting the student in making the corrections. Yes, there's a comment. I'm struggling to access Turnitin. How does one access the tool? There are problems with Turnitin at this stage, but please go to your My UNISA. There are constant updates on what is happening with the Turnitin program and how they can support students, how you can request support. They give first priority to students who are submitting for examination, who must submit their thesis through Turnitin before they can submit the final thesis. So please keep an eye on the communication on My UNISA, and also communicate with Turnitin directly. There is an email address. Communicate with Turnitin directly, but also involve your supervisor, and your supervisor will also involve the M&D coordinator in the department in order to find a solution for any possible problems with Turnitin. Then I don't see any other questions or comments. We still have time, so if anybody has any other question or any other comment, please feel free to make a comment or to ask any questions. I'll give it a minute or two, and if there aren't any, then I will just end the session. Right, so then I'm going to end this session. I would like to thank everybody for attending tonight, and I wish you well with preparing your thesis and dissertations for examination, and also attending to the comments and the feedback that you get from your examiners. And I wish you well with the rest of your studies. Good night.